Hello, and welcome to the Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective. I'm Tony Aguilar. In 1944, as a result of the Holocaust, Raphael Lemkin, a Jewish man of Polish descent, coined the term genocide and made it his life's work to get the United Nations to recognize it as a crime against humanity, which it did in 1948. While the world is now familiar with the Holocaust genocide, or the Turkish genocide against Armenians, and today's allegations of genocide against Israel due to its war against Hamas, as well as Russia's war crimes against Ukraine. Much of the world is unaware about the genocides in places such as Sudan, Myanmar, Yemen, Central African Union, and China, where millions have been killed, displaced, or wounded. While there have been successful interventions, how can present genocides be ended and future genocides be prevented? That issue next. Joining me today is Dr. Kerry Whigham, Director of Research and Online Education at the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities. He's also the Assistant Professor of Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention at Binghamton University and co-director of its Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention. His book, Resonant Violence: Affect, Memory, and Activism in Post-Genocide Societies, discusses the damaging and long-lasting legacies of genocide. Kerry, thanks for joining me today.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
I want to start off this way. I know that we all know that there is a definition as created by the United Nations, 1948. But it does seem that what is recognized as genocide is also a geopolitical question as well. So, for example, we all know South Africa has led the way to accusing Israel of genocide. But on the other side of it, he's also, President Ramaphosa is relatively quiet about Sudan. So, what creates a universal acceptance of what is to be considered genocide?
This is a great question and a really big question that motivates the field of genocide studies and genocide prevention. Because I would say ultimately at the heart of this is exactly what you're pointing out, the idea that while we have a legal definition of genocide, there are other definitions that are equally as important in this geopolitical discussion around atrocity crimes or violence that's happening around the world. So we have this legal definition that, as you mentioned, is laid out in the 1948 UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And that's a fairly narrow definition because it says that genocide is the intent to destroy in whole or in part members of four types of groups: an ethnic, racial, religious, or national group, by doing any one of five different acts. So this is a fairly narrow definition. But then we also have what I would maybe call a sociological definition that's much broader, and that actually stems from the definition that the guy who created or coined the term genocide, Raphael Lemkin, the way that he defined it, which is much broader. So Lemkin thought of genocide as a coordinated plan of any number of actions that is meant to destroy a group, but not just physically destroy them, destroy a group by destroying their culture, by destroying their language, by destroying their ability to reproduce. Any number of things can happen to destroy a group. And for Lemkin, basically any kind of identity group could be victim of genocide, not just racial, religious, national, or ethnic groups, but any group really. But then, so you have those two competing definitions, one very narrow and one quite broad. And then in the middle of that, you have what we could call the political or geopolitical definition, which varies depending on your subject position, like who you are and what you want at the moment. So for groups that are being targeted by violence, like Palestinians right now, there's a real need for what's happening in Gaza to be understood as genocide because it speaks to an experiential truth that of what they are experiencing at the moment, but also it helps to draw political attention and awareness to the violence that they're experiencing so that hopefully people will act. But also then you have like other political actors like the United States or Israel that is really resistant to applying the term genocide, not just to this case, but there's a lot of resistance in the US to apply genocide to any case. They want a very narrow definition because when you use the word genocide, and you accept that a genocide is occurring, it requires that there be action, that there be a response to it. And that's something that the US in particular is really trying to avoid at this moment, having to actually respond in any meaningful way to atrocities that are occurring. So it's really these competing understandings of genocide that are oftentimes at the heart of these conflicts that are emerging within this moment on how to understand what's going on right now in Gaza.
There has been occasions where the United States has acknowledged, at the very least, war crimes. If you go back to 1999 under the Clinton administration, and NATO has a bombing campaign against Serbia because of atrocities against Albanian Muslims. But you also had it in 2006 when Barack Obama was still the junior senator from Illinois. He's campaigning to do something about Sudan. Nancy Pelosi joins him, and at that time, Senator Biden comes out with a bill that calls for cessation of violence in Sudan. So there has been times when action has occurred. So my question is, what does it take to get a nation like the United States, the EU, to act? Because obviously it has to be somewhere in their self-interest. But what does it take? So if you look at Myanmar right now, I mean, I understand that you're not going to have military action against China because of the Uyghurs. I get that. But there are all the areas. Sudan right now is a mess right now. So, but what does it take for countries like the United States and EU to act in the way that it did in 1999, but also politically in 2006?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've already hit the nail on the head, which is the thing that it takes more than anything else is an understanding that it's within the self-interest of a nation state to act. And by self-interest here, we're talking about the national interests of that nation state. And all too often, governments don't necessarily see that it's within their national interest to, like, for the US to get involved in Sudan, for instance. Because the reality is that in an election year, there are very few voters in the US who are going to vote one way or the other on how the US responds to the atrocities that are occurring in Sudan. Likewise, I mean, I read a survey just this morning that was saying that, on a list of issues that matter to American voters right now, Israel and Palestine is at the bottom of that list. Most Americans are not voting based on how the Biden administration is responding to atrocities that are happening in the Middle East. That's just not what is on the mind of most American voters. And the reality is that what that means is that the US government doesn't actually need to take a strong stance on these things if they don't see it as in their interest to do so. Now, that is contrary to what we've said as a world, as an international community, are our responsibilities in these moments. Because in 2005, at the United Nations, the entire world unanimously agreed through the General Assembly that we have what's called a responsibility to protect. That is this concept or this norm that has emerged that says that every country in the world has a responsibility to protect its citizens, or not just citizens, its populations within its borders from experiencing genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. And when a country is failing in those responsibilities, that we have a responsibility to act within the bounds of the UN Charter. The reality is that we are not living up to that responsibility at this moment. That national interests play a much bigger role in those decisions of when to act and how to act than this accepted but ignored norm that we have a responsibility to protect people all over the world from experiencing these crimes.
Let me ask you this, because in your book, you talk about long lasting legacies of genocide. So even when a genocide, let's say, is ended, let's say Armenians in Turkey, or obviously Jewish community after the Holocaust, um, what do you see as the long lasting legacies of these very genocides? And we didn't even mention Khmer Rouge, in Cambodia. What has been the long lasting legacies of these, and how are these acting out?
The reality is that genocides, the way that the general public often thinks about them, are these horrific events that seem to appear out of nowhere. And that's often because of the way that they're reported. Oftentimes, large scale atrocities don't become, people don't learn about them until they've already reached a state where mass killing is taking place and they're at their most horrific moments. The reality is that genocides and other forms of large scale identity based violence are processes and not events. They're long-term social and political processes that begin with much earlier stages. And when we don't intervene at those early stages, they're allowed to escalate to the point where it becomes acceptable or even desirable for identity groups to be targeted because of who they are. Um, Likewise, when mass killing comes to an end, we often think about the genocide as being over, right? Because the most visible aspects of that violence is gone. But the reality is that all of those social realities that were put into place that allowed that mass killing to occur, the institutions, the social discrimination and interpersonal relationships, the ideological realities that allow people to want a group of people to be targeted for destruction, all of those are often still in place. And if we don't also deal with those realities, then it can lead to continued persecution of those groups, maybe not through mass killing, but through economic disparity, through continued social and political discrimination, through institutionalized discrimination. And we really need, I mean, you've brought up some very salient cases, but we also don't need to look any further than the US, where we're a country that is only now coming to terms with its own histories of genocide and atrocity, a country that's built on the dual atrocities of the enslavement of African populations and the genocide of indigenous populations. And these are crimes that we're only now starting to really deal with the legacies of that violence, but we can see how those legacies play out through continued segregation of populations, the legacies of redlining, through and reservations for indigenous populations. We can see economic disparities among identity groups, and we can see institutions that even when they're not maybe intentionally discriminating, there's this histories of discrimination that are sort of become part of the very structures of these institutions. So that's why it's so important to understand that genocide isn't just about physical killing. You have to look at all of these other factors that come into play that allow genocides to take place.
You've been following this for a while, obviously, and through your various organizations. And in that introduction, we named some of the places where genocide is taking place: Myanmar, China, obviously Sudan, and allegations of genocide against Israel. And that's where it is right now. But where else do you see hotspots or the beginnings of potential genocides? Because as you pointed out, it's a process. It doesn't just boom happen. It's a gradual process that culminates in genocide. So where else would you see some of the hot spots around the world that people should be concerned about?
One thing that we really believe is the idea that, so 30 years ago, it was quite unclear to us about what were the factors that put a society most at risk for genocide. Over the last 30 years, however, an incredible amount of work has been done on this, and that is no longer something that we're ignorant of. We know really well what are the factors that exist in a society that make it susceptible or that make it more likely that it will experience a genocide. And those risk factors typically fall into four different categories: risks related to governance, how people are governed and what a government looks like; risks relating to economic conditions, to how a country deals with its histories of conflict; and risks relating to social fragmentations and how social groups and identity groups interact with each other. One thing that we know is that there's no society in this, no country in this world that doesn't exhibit some level of risk. But every society in this world has different levels of risk. We can think about these risk factors like logs that can be stacked up to form, to light a fire. And not every society has, its stack of wood isn't necessarily as big, but every society has some logs on that fire, and we all have work that we can do to move some of those logs off the fire. Still, just because one society has a small stack of wood and one society has a really big stack of wood, doesn't mean that if a triggering event happens, a match is lit, that stack of wood can't ignite into mass atrocity. That's so we often look for those triggering events, which are really hard to predict. But that said, every society in this world has work to do to remove some of those stacks of wood from its fire. That said, there are obviously some societies that are some countries that are more on the brink of really igniting into fire than others. I think some that are really there that we haven't been paying attention to. Sudan, I think we're not paying nearly as much attention to as we should. India, the vast increase of violence against the Muslim minority in India over the last few years has been stunning and horrifying, to the point where I think we can think about it as transitioning towards definitely atrocity crimes and not, if not genocide. And then also there's all of these continuing violence. Latin America is a region that has been neglected by the US lately, I'd say, with foreign policy. And yet we see Central America, Venezuela, and the violence in these regions continuing to have massive impacts, including the large flow of migrant and refugee populations that are trying to enter the US. So I don't know, all of these are situations that we should be attentive to. But like I said, every society has some work that can be done to eliminate some of these risk factors.
My question then to you would be, through your work at the Institute, how do you get a genocide, a genocidal situation, to be at the center of political debate at a nation such as the United States, or as I said, EU? How do you begin to do that? Sudan had its day in the United States in terms of being of interest back in the early 2000s. It is no longer that case. The big issue for a lot of people, even though Israel, that issue is low on the totem pole of issues that people are concerned about, still we saw the protests around college campuses on that issue. So there was some interest and it was heavily covered by the media. Obviously, not the point of view that people wanted to see in terms of that issue. But how do you make it part of the agenda of a country like ours?
Yeah, it's a really difficult question because of that question of national interest. One thing that we really try to do is, first of all, expand the way that people think about what prevention is. Because all too often when people hear the idea of genocide prevention or atrocity prevention, the first thing that pops into their head is military intervention in the midst of mass killing. And that is one very, very small component of what prevention is. What we really try to think about is prevention as a continuum. So it goes through various stages. So upstream prevention are the actions that we can take long before mass killing breaks out to deal with those and mitigate those risk factors that we know to be associated with atrocities, to try and mitigate them so that things never reach the stage of mass killing. Midstream prevention are the actions that we take while mass killing is taking place to make sure that as few people as possible die. And downstream prevention are the actions that we take in the aftermath of mass killing to make sure that we deal with those legacies that I was talking about, so that all of those structural issues are dealt with, so that mass killing doesn't recur. Because one thing that we know is one of the biggest risk factors for genocide is if a country has already experienced a genocide in the last 40 years or so. It makes a country statistically much more likely to experience a recurrence. And that's largely because societies aren't dealing with those structural factors that allowed a genocide to happen to begin with. Now, the reality is that when we get to that midstream prevention phase, that phase that most people think about as what genocide prevention is, the number of tools that we have in our toolbox are so much more limited than if we think about upstream prevention, dealing with those structural realities, those risk factors, so that things never reach the midstream phase. And what we see again and again is when we get to that phase, when we wait until mass killing is already taking place, building up the energy and convincing nation states of their interest and responsibility to engage in those moments is so difficult. Um, uh, and here is where civil society and activists play a huge role, NGOs play a huge role, because it's in those moments where we see a real need for those in political power to understand and be pushed by those outside of the halls of government to take action, to say, actually, it's unacceptable for you not to act in this moment. We require you to act. So that's why seeing protests, seeing other forms of advocacy from non-governmental organizations, that becomes really important in these moments where atrocities are actually occurring. But even then, once things reach the stage that they've reached in Gaza, in Sudan, they've reached that stage because of a real failure on our part as an international community to prevent. Right? It's not like, now we're not talking about prevention really. We're talking about, like, trying our failure to prevent and trying to make up for it. So this is one thing that we're really advocating for, trying to think much more upstream so we don't find ourselves in these moments where it becomes so much more impossible to figure out how to act.
Let me ask you a question though, because I want to go back to when you talked about India, for example.
Mhm.
India under President Modi obviously has been, going against the Muslim population, and he's doing that for political purposes, and we all know that. But the other side of that is India is probably, in terms of population, the largest democracy on earth right now, population wise.
Yeah.
And so, how feasible is it to think the United States or the EU is really going to go against India when they're looking at a geopolitical situation where if you go against India, you might push India into the arms of Russia or China. So how do you get around the geopolitical aspect of this? Not only with India, but let's take China and the Uyghurs, for example. As much as we may talk about what China is doing in terms of dumping and the economic issue, we really don't touch the issue of human rights when it comes to China because there's an economic self-interest. So how do you get around the geopolitical aspect of this and the economic aspect?
Yeah, and really, this is the impasse that we as a world find ourselves at this moment, and it's exemplified in the United Nations Security Council, where basically the UN Security Council and the way that the world, like through the UN, approaches human rights and its response to genocide and atrocities, it's almost fallen back into this Cold War mentality, where exactly as you say. Countries are aligning themselves with either Russia and China, which only care about a geopolitical influence and power, and don't care at all, and don't care at all how people are treated within those borders. Like they don't, human rights is not a concern for those countries, and the U.S. and Europe, which see themselves as, which are in a difficult moment of trying to maintain this idea as of themselves as global superpowers that respect human rights, but are also balancing that with economic interests at home, and balancing that with constituencies that don't necessarily care as much about foreign policy. So it's really, really difficult to know how to respond in those moments, because the correct response geopolitically for the US government is not necessarily aligned with what I would say is the moral and ethical responsibility of the United States at these moments. And I think we're in a global moment where those geopolitical concerns, and maybe we've always been in this moment, but those geopolitical concerns are taking much more precedence than any sort of ethical or moral concerns are, which is troubling.
And just to stay with that for a minute, what happens when genocidal wars become proxy wars, like Sudan? That has become proxy war for countries of the Middle East. You have Saudi Arabia and countries like that on one side and other countries on the other side. So they become proxy wars almost, which adds another dynamic to an already dire situation. And so I guess my question is it's really too late to enter some of these issues into, let's say, a presidential race, because it's already set along the lines of what issues are going to move the presidential race, let's say, of the United States. The United Nations has proved itself to be, maybe, I won't say totally powerless, but if I go back to the 1999 bombing of Serbia, um, NATO didn't go for the UN Security Council because Russia and China said that they were going to veto it. So they went on ahead anyway. So I guess my question is, what kind of organizing needs to be done to really make sure that these issues are brought to the center of political debate? It can't happen just with the United States. It has to happen in other places. So, does your organization work with other organizations internationally as well as nationally to see how to make this bubble up to the top of the agenda? And knowing that there's all of these different dynamics, which make it very difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that you're being generous with your description of the UN. I think like right now the UN is completely ineffective in its response to atrocities, and that's because the Security Council in itself is it's impossible to move anywhere when it comes to human rights. And the UN was in fact built as an institution to preserve and protect human rights. So we're at a moment where actually the UN is totally failing at its central goal, at its founding goal. What we are trying to do at the Auschwitz Institute in particular, our work is primarily with governments and trying to get government actors who are working within bureaucratic structures to apply what Alex Bellamy calls an atrocity prevention lens to everything that they're doing. So to think about every policy decision that they're making, whether it has to do with foreign policy, trade with other countries, or whether it has to do with educational policy at home or agricultural policy at home, to ask them to think about how this policy is going to impact the vulnerability or the protection of the human rights of certain identity groups in their country or other countries. So to ask how any policy can contribute to the prevention of atrocities and other forms of large-scale identity-based violence. One thing that we see a lot of hope in when the UN is not living up to the vision of what we want it to do is regional networks. So, for instance, there's a Latin American network for genocide and mass atrocity prevention, which is a network formed by 18 member countries in Latin America, people who are interested within government in applying that atrocity prevention lens and seeing how countries within the region can support each other in developing their own atrocity prevention capacity. There's a similar network that we've worked with building in the Great Lakes region of Africa, in Central and Eastern Africa. And these regional networks can be really effective in ways that like an international organization like the UN can't be, because they're much more nimble. And also because it's easier to develop ideas of shared interests with states that are within one region, because they see very clearly how instability in one state can easily spill over into instability in other states. So that's one thing that we're doing in the current moment to try and push against the inertia within the UN, is try to refocus attention on regional actors in the way that the states within a region, the role that they can play in supporting atrocity prevention work in other countries within the regions.
In, in keeping with that for a moment, where do you see would be the best place right now for intervention to end genocide that would send a message beyond its borders? So where would that place be? Would it be Sudan? Would it be Myanmar? Would it be Hamas, Israel, Hamas? Where would be the best place to send a message right now in terms of world powers to say that we're going to end this here and utilize that as a model for other nations to say that if you don't end it, this is what could happen to you? Because again, I want to go back to 1999. It did, whether people agreed with the bombing campaign or not, it did send out somewhat of a message that the United States was willing to engage in that. But where should there be actual engagement at right now? Because you can't be at all places. So where would you go if you had the choice?
For me, and this is me personally, I think that so much global attention is rightfully being placed on what's happening in Gaza, that this is the most direct place that we need to be focusing our attention. And step number one, that I don't know why we haven't taken this step yet, is the US has to stop providing arms to Israel. The fact that just days ago, a US bomb was used to bomb a tent encampment, like a group of tents in Gaza, uh, it's absolutely unacceptable by every standard of international humanitarian law. And the fact that the US is still giving arms to Israel when those weapons are being used for that kind of destruction is absolutely unacceptable. It would be the easiest thing in the world for the US to say, you no longer get weapons from us, because what's happening now in Gaza can no longer be justified as a response to the horrors of October 7th. And what happened on October 7th is absolutely unacceptable. It should never have happened, and the perpetrators of those crimes should be brought to justice. But what Israel is doing in response is absolutely unacceptable as well, according to all standards of international humanitarian human rights law. And we can't be supporting it as a country.
So given that, because the International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for the head of Hamas and President and Prime Minister Netanyahu.
Yeah.
Now the problem is that I think both you and I know that at least with Netanyahu, that's never going to occur. Um, the head of Hamas might be a different story. So, but that's not going to occur because when you do issue those things, and nothing happens because arrest warrants have also been issued for President Putin, and we know that's not going to happen. So are these symbolic things of the ICC of which the United States is not a member of? So I guess the question is, what needs to happen that is more than symbolic but has an actual result to it? Because Netanyahu, unless he's found guilty in his own court in Israel, he's not being arrested by anybody outside of his nation.
You're you're right that it's very, very unlikely that Putin or Netanyahu will ever be arrested and brought to justice in the International Criminal Court. It's highly unlikely. That said, There is something important about the indictments being issued, and I hope that the ICC that does issue the indictments is allowed to issue the indictments fully. Um, because there's something very important in the same way with the International Court of Justice's ruling in The Hague. Um, Rulings have a symbolic weight, but that symbolic weight is often necessary to remind us of who we are as an international community, what we choose to value, and what we find unacceptable. Even if these perpetrators are not brought to justice, there's an expressive value in those indictments that is essential. That said, it can't be only about those symbolic measures, like you said. And this is where things like stopping the sale of arms to Israel becomes so important. It's where steps like Ireland and Spain last week recognizing Palestine as a state become important measures that can be taken that are both symbolic but have a real impact in the way that that violence unfolds and what the future might look like. So it's important to have both these symbolic and very real impactful measures happening at the same time if we want to bring an end to this violence.
In the time we have left, where are you most hopeful in terms of curbing the incidence of genocide?
It's a good question and a difficult question because we're living in a moment where we see a lot. We just see so much violence, identity-based violence happening all around us. So it becomes really hard at these moments to focus on the good. One case that I come back to a lot that exemplifies where I see hope is Kenya. Kenya experienced horrific violence, electoral violence in 2007 and 2008, where thousands of people were killed in the aftermath of a disputed election. Um, and the following election, 5 years later, that same thing could have happened. We could have seen a recurrence of that violence, but instead, what we saw was the international community, led by Kofi Annan at that moment, the Kenyan national government, and hundreds of grassroots, community-based civil society organizations coming together, working together to develop a system so that they could respond to early and recognize any risks of electoral violence happening in the next election. And what happened because of that network that they created around Kenya was that almost no violence occurred in that following election. And the same thing happened in the election after that. And I see so much hope in this because what it demonstrates to me is that the real hope when we're thinking about prevention comes from finding ways of working together with the international community, supporting the work at the national level and at the hyper-local level to respond to the very real and very specific realities that any specific country is experiencing. That's where I see hope. That's where I see the real power of true prevention coming into play.
And you see the president of Kenya leading the way in terms of providing troops for Haiti, which is also a good sign, I would guess. And
Absolutely. International cooperation, international collaboration is essential when we want
mhm.
to deal with these wicked problems that plague us.
And I guess for me, the question is always getting these issues to the forefront because there are people who are aware of what's going on in terms of genocide around the world, whether it's Israel or the Congo or wherever it may be occurring at. People are aware of this, but it does not seem to resonate in a general sense with many populations until there is a reaction in terms of immigration. And there you begin to see, then people begin to react, but they don't really react to the cause of migration. They react to the consequence of what's going on. So you see, even in Europe now, Italy, you know, um, what they're doing in terms of some of the the deals that they have made with African nations and all across Europe as it becomes more right wing, particularly because of immigration. So the consequences of genocide and these mass atrocities is also the issue of migration. And how do you begin to take, let's say, that issue and say, listen, if you don't want to deal with migration, you're going to have to deal with these core issues that's now occurring in these nations. So is that a part of the strategy that needs to be undertaken by various organizations, NGOs, as well as governments?
Absolutely. One of the projects that we're working on now with at the Auschwitz Institute and also with my other organization, the Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention, is a program called Safer Havens, which is looking specifically at this issue of forced displacement of populations and the impacts that it has. And the reality is that we're now living in a moment where there are more forcibly displaced people, migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, than at any other point in human history. And the vast majority of those people who have been displaced because of atrocities. So first and foremost, as you point out, if we want to deal with this issue of forced displacement and this crisis that we're dealing with as a globe right now around displacement, we need to be thinking about prevention, because it's atrocities that are making people that are actually doing the displacement of people. But I think in response, we also need to think about those victims of displacement, the people who are displaced, are oftentimes at the highest risk for identity-based violence at the countries that are receiving them or that are hosting them after they've been displaced. So they're being displaced by atrocities, but then they're also at incredibly high risk for atrocities or other forms of identity-based violence in their new countries. So this really requires a reorientation of our values as an international community, and thinking about migrants and refugees not as a problem to be dealt with, but as people who share a humanity with us, and that actually we have a responsibility toward. This is the way that I think about these things. And not only that we have a responsibility toward, but for instance, there was an article a few weeks ago in the New York Times talking about how one town in Maine that was suffering incredibly from economic depression has been totally revitalized and rejuvenated because of the immigrant population that has entered as the migrant and refugee population who has entered into this community in Maine. We need to think about this not just as a problem, but as an opportunity to actually not only respond to the issues that these populations are suffering, but also to respond to our own problems, other problems that we're dealing with in our society. This is an opportunity to actually improve things. It's not only a problem; it's actually a pathway to open up a new future for the societies where these populations are entering.
My last question to you is this, and we did not really touch on the Russia Ukraine
Mm.
atrocity and what's going on there, because it does seem to me that we have two things going on. One is, do we do nothing about atrocities, genocide, and this tremendous violence that's going on? But also, as other nations feel free to attack other nations, that's going to create another problem of genocide. So we have Russia with Ukraine. If they win, that gives momentum to China for perhaps going into Taiwan and perhaps other nations who are thinking about invading other nations as well. So, how does that play into your thinking, your organization's thinking about how to deal with the issue of genocide as well? Because you were talking about preventive measures, and it seems to me that one of the ways to prevent it is to prohibit nations from attacking other nations.
You're absolutely right. And this is where we get into that overlap between the very real and concrete impacts of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which is and the atrocities that they've perpetrated there, but also the symbolic impact, which is in this case, I think, equally as damaging or damaging in a different way, because what it does is reorient our values about what we find acceptable as an international community. And I think if Russia is allowed to continue its campaign in Ukraine, if depending on the way that the U.S. elections go, we already now are seeing a decrease in support for Ukraine in the U.S. by U.S. politicians on both sides of the aisle, but especially with Republicans. If, depending on how the election goes, I think if Trump wins the election in the U.S., then I think we'll see a complete pullback of support of Ukraine. And the impacts of that, I think, could be absolutely massive, for not just for the U.S., but for the world, because it does open the door for taking us back what feels like centuries, in the idea that the way that we solve that countries have the right are the potential to expand their territory by just invading other countries. That's an acceptable thing to do, which is absolutely insane. And it's hard to imagine how we can keep order in the world if that becomes the basis for acceptability in the international community. So yeah, I see both the concrete, but also the symbolic weight of this response, the way that we're responding to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and it has a direct impact in risk for genocide and in the way that we think about prevention. Absolutely.
Do you think genocides will increase if there's a change of administration in the United States?
I think the risk for genocide and other forms of identity-based violence will absolutely increase. We saw that in 2016 when Trump came into office in the U.S. Several scholars, genocide scholars, James Waller, Alexander Hinton, both wrote extensively about the U.S. and the elevation of risk for genocide in the U.S. because of the Trump administration. And I think that will only be worse next time when on a second term for Trump, where he doesn't even feel constrained by the need to run again. Though I'm sure he will also try to amend the Constitution so he can run a third term too. I think it will be a massive. It will be. I'm really scared, honestly, about what would happen in a second term.
My guest today has been Dr. Kerry Whigham, Director of Research at the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities, and the Assistant Professor of Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention at Binghamton University. Kerry, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much.
And join us again next week as we discuss another issue of international importance here on the Aguilar Conversations, A Global Perspective.
The Aguilar Conversations, A Global Perspective, is produced by Casa Margo Communications Group.